So this time I'm going to be talking about sugar. You probably have wished you didn't ask me by the time you got to this, but because whenever I do presentations, I like to kind of do a bit of a deep dive. And I'm like, I'll just cover what I did before. And then I decided that's not appropriate. But anyway, I hope you enjoy this talk into sugar. I'll try and keep it as quick as I can so we can have time to answer questions. But in the meantime, please put anything in the chat box. I'll see if I can, I'll deal with it as I go along. Otherwise, I'll deal with it at the end. So I don't think many of you need an introduction to me. I have been on my journey to nutrition started as a result of my autoimmune condition, because changing my diet basically changed my life. And I've done all sorts of things along my journey. I took out gluten initially. I started healing my gut. I've been on a big journey with sugar as well. I was a sugar fiend as a child. My favorite foods are probably almond croissants, brioche. My mum was always worried at Christmas if she hadn't made me a brioche and wondered what the reaction I might have. I loved pavlova. And I think being a sports person, back when I was at school, I was on a blood sugar roller coaster throughout my entire teen years. And I have a feeling it didn't really help manifest with the manifestation of my autoimmune condition. And obviously I can't go back and change it, but I definitely lived on that blood sugar roller coaster. So today we're going to talk all about sugar, but just to say this is for educational purposes only. You need to consult with your own doctor, and but hopefully this is still very useful. And also a reminder that we are all very different human beings. And so one piece of advice may be right for someone else, and it's not right for you, but really the overarching principles of what I'm going to talk about is probably applicable to everyone. So humans, going back in human history, we're actually hardwired to eat sugar, which is probably why it's such a big problem. But what today, the very genetic adaptations that once served us so well in hunter-gatherer times, especially the ability to quickly raise our blood sugar when food is scarce, has now led to lots of metabolic health issues and undesirable health outcomes as sugar has become so ubiquitous in our environment. We actually have 3 hormones that raise our blood sugar. They're called glucagon, which is released from the pancreas. And then we've got cortisol and adrenaline that all help us raise our blood sugar. And so we can run away from that tiger. We can actually keep our blood sugar within good levels. But we've only got one hormone that actually lowers our blood sugar, and that's insulin. And which kind of, I think, indicates where we've come from as human beings. And really, our environment has changed so much over thousands and thousands of years, but really our genetics, I think they say not even 1% of our genetics has really changed. So simple carbohydrates that very quickly raise our blood sugar are now extremely readily available. They can be very low cost, and probably some of the highest sugar foods are the ones that are the cheapest foods that you can buy. So if you haven't got a large disposable income, it can be a lot easier to buy high sugar processed foods than it is to buy fresh foods. And they're also widely marketed, and that's driven obviously by a lot of these companies have got into this game. They want you to eat their foods all the time. They want to make money. The foods that are high in sugar often are also high in hydrogenated fats. So the fats that are really inflammatory for us, processed salt, and then other things, but they're often highly processed and highly palatable, which activates the brain reward centers. And this can have a similar effect to alcohol and other substances, so drugs and everything else. And so therefore, this can make them, once we have them in our diet, it's not just, I'm going to take out sugar one day and stop eating it, because we have all of these withdrawal symptoms and everything else from actually taking sugar out, which makes it very hard. And often these hyperpalatable foods, they also bypass our normal satiety hormones, so we overconsume them. So when we eat nutrient-dense foods in the right balance, we normally feel full. But what happens when we eat these foods, and especially if we eat them really quickly, like how quickly do you eat a chocolate bar or something you find from the supermarket, and especially if they're high in fructose, they totally overwhelm our satiety systems and we don't feel full. So we just keep on eating and eating and eating. And then over time, when the cycle is repeated, it leads over time to blood sugar regulation, which we'll go into in detail later. So sweetness is actually a sign of safety and also nutrient density. So the sweet taste sensation was one of the ways that the hunter-gatherers were able to tell whether a food was toxic or not. Obviously, they had a whole realm of foods to choose from, but if it was sweet, it was a lot less likely to not be poisonous and also have a high nutrient to toxin ratio. Sweetness was also a guide to the most calorie-rich foods, which is why now things like artificial sweeteners cause such a big problem. Honey, which many people don't think that hunter-gatherers and the like used to eat sugar, but honey was actually quite readily eaten by some communities over the world, and it could take up to 20% or even 50% of their diet during certain months of the year, so on a very seasonal basis, depending on availability of other foods, the climate, etc. And it's obviously as you know, it's a very concentrated sweetener. It is sweet, it indicates nutrient and calorie density, but it also has lots of other beneficial properties in it. So it has many enzymes, proteins, trace minerals, flavonoids, and other polyphenols, which will help. It has roles in the body other than just being a sweetener, because it's got other nutrients in it. It'll help with other chemical reactions. It can also have antibacterial properties. So, for example, it can help. It's been shown to reduce the duration of things like childhood diarrhea and things. It also has potentially beneficial effects on blood markers. This has been shown in scientific studies more recently, such as LDL cholesterol, triglycerides, CRP levels, homocysteine, and blood glucose in overweight and obese patients, which some of these trials, like food trials, are very confusing. They're often showing correlation, not necessarily causation, so they're quite hard to do. But still, the honey is shown when eaten in moderation as a relatively healthy food, but as long as we eat it in our moderation. But what now has happened is that if we're thinking, going back to what hunter-gatherers did, is they thought that, well, they realized that sweetness correlated to calorie density. What we're now conditioned to think is that sweetness is unhealthy. And so instead of using it as a guide to find the most calorie-rich foods and not eating very many of them, we're trying to figure out how to avoid calorie density with the sweet taste. So I think I got that wrong. So we want to basically have these sweet tastes that taste amazing and make us feel good, but we don't want to have the calorie density that goes alongside it. And this is dangerous because it means we're bypassing all sorts of systems in our body and confusing the innate genetics that we actually have. So average consumption of sugar, and obviously it's very hard to judge, and this is done based on sugar, the amount of sugar delivered over the different centuries. But it's still relatively true, and it definitely shows how sugar consumption has changed. So before the 1600s, refined sugar wasn't a thing, it wasn't made. So it was just the naturally occurring sugars we have in our environment. And since then, the sugar consumption has dramatically increased, spurred on by the Industrial Revolution of the 1800s, the rise of big foods in the 1900s, and then the demonization of dietary fats in the first half of the 20th century, when basically fats were stripped from foods, and fat actually makes food taste good. So when they took away the fat, they then added sugar. So you can see in 1700s, on average, people ate 4.9 grams a day. In the 1800s, it had tripled to 22.4 grams a day. 1900s, it had times 5 from there, 112 grams a day, to 2000, 227 grams a day on average is the consumption of sugar in the world. And obviously this is an average. And so some people, I like to think like me, would eat less than that, but that means people are also going to be eating more than that, which is even more terrifying. And the body is not designed all the time to have to lower our blood sugar. And this is what it's being made to do, which is extremely damaging. And it's putting pressure on the whole body. And just to put it in context of teaspoons, so 1 teaspoon of sugar is 1 teaspoon of sugar equals 4 grams. So 227 grams is 56.75 teaspoons of sugar, which is quite horrifying. Anyway, I'll move on. So never before have we had the emergency need to lower our blood sugar. The increased consumption of processed and refined foods, environmental toxicity and stress creates this unique situation. And today I'm not really going to go into environmental toxicity and stress, but they also affect our blood sugar regulation, because what happens is when we stress out our body, it produces cortisol, the hormone. The cortisol is released from our adrenal glands, which then it basically thinks we're in an emergency state. We need to run away from that metaphorical tiger. So it releases stored forms of glucose and puts it into the blood. So all of that stress can actually increase your blood sugar. So actually, I'll talk a bit about continuous glucose monitors later, but I had a friend of mine who was using one last week, and she went to a boxing class, and she noticed during the course of the boxing class, her blood sugar went up, and she felt, looking back, she realized it was quite a stressful class, but it just shows you some things that you think are good for you are actually having the opposite effect. So I'm going to get a bit geeky, because I know we have people on varying sides of the spectrum here, but I think this is quite interesting. So I wanted to talk about cellular respiration. So this is the process by which we make carbohydrates into energy, so the carbohydrates that we eat. So when we eat carbohydrates, and that could be anything from a potato, which contains carbohydrates, to fruit, to really fast-acting sugar. It goes into the body, it's broken down by the digestive tract, and it is made into glucose. The glucose is then absorbed through the digestive tract into the bloodstream, when then our pancreas, our central nervous system notices that we have a higher blood sugar. And so it produces insulin from the pancreas to basically, the role of pancreas, of the insulin, is to open up our cells to let the sugar or the glucose in. So the sugar goes into the cells, and then here it is converted into what's called adenosine triphosphate, or ATP, which is the energy currency of our cell. And that's what all of us run off in terms of energy. And this is the process that's called cellular respiration. Proteins and fats can also be used to make ATP, but in a slightly different way. And the fastest way to make it is using glucose. So what happens is, after we eat our meal, obviously our blood sugar is going to lower over time because of the amount of insulin released, which is taking sugar from the bloodstream into the cells. And so what happens, once all of the sugar from our bloodstream is used up, our body releases stored forms of sugar from our muscles and our liver and puts that into our blood, so it can be taken up by cells to also be used as energy. And what ideally in the modern world, what would happen is that we could move between using glucose and stored glucose and also stored fat for energy. And so we can use all of these forms to make ATP, which our body needs all of the time. The issue is, due to our modern diets, is that our ability to get ATP from sources like fat can be greatly diminished if we eat high carbohydrate diets. And so we are not as what we call metabolically flexible as what we used to be. So mostly in modern day society, due to high carbohydrate diets, people are sugar burners and they rely on carbohydrates as fuel. So that means we're getting our ATP from glucose or sugar. When you are a sugar burner, you can burn carbohydrates as fuel, but not fats. But when you're a fat burner, you can burn both carbohydrates and fats. But you can change this with your diet. And what often happens if we eat high sugar diets is that, or high carbohydrate diets, is that when our sugar is in our blood, or our glucose is in our blood, it goes into our cells for use for energy. And then excess, if we have excess left, it will be stored by our liver, and it'll also be stored by our muscles. And we're going to use that stored carbohydrate for use at a later time. If we have even more left over, it is stored in our fat cells or adipose tissue as triglycerides. And so that's when a high carbohydrate diet can then lead to increased fat. And the issue is what we've just talked about, is that if you have a high carbohydrate diet and eat a lot of refined carbohydrates, you're a lot less likely to be able to burn fat for fuel. So those adipose tissues don't then get used later to make energy, if that makes sense. The other key thing, which I think is really interesting, is relation to cellular respiration. So this process in relation to inflammation. So every time we make ATP or we create energy, we are actually releasing what we call reactive oxygen species. And these are also known as free radicals or oxidants. And these are basically damaging to our body. They are immune cells and they are driving an inflammatory response. And when this happens after a meal, because we're making energy after a meal, it's called postprandial oxidative stress or inflammation. So all food and all eating patterns cause this inflammation, but there are worse culprits than others, which are, one, the biggest one, overeating. So when we eat too much in one go, we eat too fast, we bypass the satiety systems, we don't notice them, we just eat for the sake of eating. Or when we eat high carbohydrate diets, especially the ones that are full of refined carbohydrates that raise blood sugar much faster than whole food sources of the complex carbohydrates, which are things like vegetables. The more glucose we eat, the more inflammation we have. And this is why it really helps being metabolically flexible, i.e. burning fat for fuel, because it means you can actually get some of your energy from fat sources, which is actually less inflammatory than getting it from sugar sources. So in a healthy body, we should be able to neutralize these reactive oxygen species or free radicals by nutrients in our diet known as antioxidants, so vitamins and minerals, because these basically, in a scientific term, what they do is they donate an electron to the reactive oxygen species or the free radical to neutralize it. But if we don't have a nutrient-dense diet, we cannot do that. And so these molecules go around the body and create more havoc, especially in anyone with an autoimmune condition. We've already got inflammation. So we want to make sure that we're not generating more. It also causes even more issues in those with obesity or metabolic syndrome. Because in these people, people often have a lower insulin sensitivity. So basically what that means is that insulin can't get glucose into cells as readily. So we have to produce more insulin. And also if we don't eat a nutrient-dense diet, it can also have more of an effect. So insulin also is inflammatory and causes a stress response. And it's been interesting to see that in volunteers with a normal blood sugar level who have a higher fasting insulin levels, they also had more markers of inflammation like CRP. So unfortunately, the modern diet is also typified by calorie-rich, nutrient-poor eating, and which causes surges in blood sugar, but also we don't have as many antioxidants to combat these oxidative species we produce all the time. So I think the key takeaway from this is that good blood sugar control and a nutrient-dense diet is really crucial for controlling inflammation. So I will share all of these slides afterwards, so I'll just run through these and people can read through things in more detail if they want to, but the many, many, many impacts of eating sugar. So we've already talked about it activates the reward centers in the brain, leading to cravings for more. The lack of sustained energy and focus after initial burst. So when we're a sugar burner, we eat a lot of high refined sugars, we will produce a lot of sugar, we'll have a lot of energy initially, and then our sugar levels, because we overproduce insulin effectively, our bodies will crash, our energy levels will crash, we'll have poor concentration and we'll get cravings. And that cycle just keeps on going, and we call it the blood sugar roller coaster. There's increased obesity risk and nutrient deficiency. So the World Health Organization states that high intakes of free sugars threaten the nutrient quality of diets by providing significant energy or calories without specific nutrients. And also sugars are not empty calories. They actually pull out nutrients out of your body because they need to have nutrients to be metabolized. So they have a net negative nutrient impact on your body. They affect our hormones and the immune system because Our blood sugar regulation requires hormones, and all of our hormones interact with each other. And so it has kind of a knock-on impact on all of your other hormones. So your stress hormones, your reproductive hormones, all sorts of things that can affect menopause, fertility, your thyroid, but also your hormones are very closely related to your immune system. So they also can relate and cause further immune system havoc. It affects your gut health. So sugar affects the makeup of the microbiome, and it encourages more opportunist pathogens to survive. Basically, ones we don't necessarily want there, or we want to be kept under control. So some different types of bacteria can be more damaging than others. It can promote the abundance of yeast, or like that sometimes causes things like thrush and other things in our body. And it can also turn off digestion. And as we've discussed many times, gut health and having an intact gut lining is really essential to support people with autoimmune conditions, and also potentially to prevent autoimmune diseases even arising in the first place. Pretty obvious, but needs to be stated, increased risk for diabetes and cardiovascular disease, and also other chronic diseases because of the link to most chronic diseases to inflammation. And I've already mentioned that most sugar-laden food is also high in omega-6 fats and also processed salt and other man-made substances. It affects our nervous system. So the nervous system is the conductor of our blood sugar regulation system. And so if we're going to overwhelm this, it's going to overwhelm our nervous system, and it will most likely put us in a chronic sympathetic or fight or flight state. And so when we're in that state, we don't want to digest our food. Our immune system doesn't want to work. All we want to do is do those emergency things that we need to do to survive and not thrive. It affects our brains. So type 3 diabetes is now being used for Alzheimer's disease, because they think it's got a really high correlation to having blood sugar dysregulation and specifically high insulin levels. So we've seen how much that is increasing in our society, and we've seen how much sugar increases. It also impacts our liver and pancreas function. So both the liver is used to store carbohydrates. The pancreas is obviously used to release hormones like insulin. And so when we overuse these or we abuse sugar, it can also affect the function of these. And I think especially in people with autoimmune conditions, our liver is already impacted by the crucial medications that we take. And I'm not saying don't take them, but these will put our liver under more pressure. Our environment puts our liver under heaps of pressure. And so this just adds to the burden. High sugar diets can lead to things like fatty liver. And then the other thing is, which might be unknown to quite a lot of people, is that sugar can create AGEs, which are advanced glycation end products. And this is when sugar reacts with protein, and a similar chemical reaction to that gives brown food like toast its flavor. And basically, this is when kind of sugar reacts with proteins, and it covers up. It stops receptors being available in the body and all sorts of things. And so this can narrow the vessels in the eyes, kidneys, feet, and brain. It can damage the arterial walls, joints, cellular membranes. It can impair communication between and within cells. It disrupts our metabolism and energy production, increases oxidative stress and premature skin aging. Anyway, I'm exhausted by talking about the impacts of sugar, but it just shows what it can do. But sometimes we don't really give it a second thought because our cravings and everything else take over. And just to talk a bit about blood sugar regulation and dysfunction. So healthy blood sugar regulation is indicated by a consistent energy level and reduced cravings throughout the day. And then blood sugar dysregulation is a spectrum. It doesn't happen overnight. It's a very gradual process. And just a big disclaimer on this, I am not a medical doctor. So this is for educational purposes only. And I don't want you to diagnose yourself with anything by what you see on the next few slides. So what happens is we go through different stages. So someone that has type 2 diabetes doesn't necessarily get type 2 diabetes overnight. And so I was going to walk you briefly through that process. So just first of all, I think we've talked about this in previous presentations as the blood sugar roller coaster that kind of leads to all of these problems. And we've talked about it a bit. So ideally, we should eat a nutrient-dense meal that has proteins, fats, and carbohydrates. And our blood sugar will increase after our meal. but it'll increase a bit, and then it'll be decreased by insulin. And then when you have your next meal, it'll increase slightly again. And it'll basically be a nice wave throughout the day that stays within this blue box. Unfortunately, what happens is that many people in society, and nowhere near everyone, some people have very good blood sugar dysregulation, but a lot of people will eat a meal that's, say, rich in refined carbohydrates. Their blood sugar will fly up. Our body then produces insulin to try and get it down. But what happens is that over time, we don't initially produce enough insulin to lower it. So our pancreas keeps on pumping it out and pumping it out and pumping it out. And so eventually what happens is our blood sugar lowers to a really low level because we produce too much insulin. So that's when we get cravings, we get a low mood, we get grumpy, etc. And that's when we go and have our coffee, have our sweets, have whatever we want. And then the whole process happens over and over again. And it's this process happening over and over again that then causes the issues that we'll just talk now. So, as I said, phase 0 is normal function. So we have consistent energy levels and we have metabolic flexibility. So we can use our glucose, we can use glucose from food, we can use stored fats, we can use stored carbohydrates based on what our body needs. And so we have stable energy throughout the day. Phase 1, compromised blood sugar regulation. We have increased cravings for sugar and refined carbohydrates. We have increased hunger and reduced satiation from our meals, so it doesn't last us as long. We have maybe a bit of weight gain, we have increased blood sugar pressure, and we may have some difficulty burning fat for weight loss, and this is because we're losing the ability to use fat for fuel. Phase 2, so this is when we have lots of insulin being pumped into our body in relation to what we eat. And this causes kind of high blood sugar, low blood sugar patterns, which we really just talked about. So here we have fatigue and low energy, strong cravings for sweets and caffeine, because caffeine can help us increase our blood sugar. We have ravenous hunger, irritability if meals are missed. We feel jittery or shaky between meals, sweating, rapid irregular heartbeat, memory issues, difficulty concentrating, and insomnia. So in the next phase is what we call insulin resistance. And this is when our cells of our body have taken on so much glucose that they don't want to take on anymore. So what they do is if you imagine that each cell has different gates on it, and say it's got normally 100 gates. And so when the insulin acts on the gates, it lets glucose in. But the cell goes, I don't want any more sugar, so I'm going to take away half my gates. So I've now only got 50 gates to let the sugar into my cell when acted on by the insulin. And so what happens is that our cells get fed up, they take off the insulin gates, and so we can't get sugar into our cells. And that is called insulin resistance, because the insulin doesn't have the same impact as it used to, because our body doesn't really want it. So we have more insulin being produced, more blood sugar in our bloodstream, and that causes more effects like increased hunger, increased tiredness, brain fog, difficulty focusing, increased weight gain, increased blood sugar and cholesterol levels, increased blood pressure, depression, mood disorders, hormone imbalances, slow aging, and premature aging. And this is when you're really on your journey to getting getting metabolic syndrome and then type 2 diabetes, which metabolic syndrome and type 2 diabetes are kind of two different phases of a very similar thing. And it can be kind of diagnosed through things like your blood, and I obviously don't diagnose, by your blood test levels, looking at your HbA1c level, which is your long-term blood glucose levels, your glucose levels. It can be looked at using insulin levels, high blood pressure, and looking at your cholesterol numbers as well, because it all affects your cholesterol in an adverse way. When you have diabetes, it also affects, you have extreme hunger and thirst because you cannot get that energy in your cells. We have persistent hunger even after meals, frequent urination, tingling in our hands, high levels of infections, etc., etc. Anyway, but the key point is it's a spectrum. And so we don't just get the last thing overnight, it happens over time. And just looking at the daily signs. So when we have a normal blood sugar regulation will feel very different to if we have insulin resistance, when we cannot get that sugar in our cells. And that's very different to the middle column, which is when we have a high insulin and low blood sugar. So our energy is going up and down. So normally we should arise in the morning with energy and the feeling of being rested. But if you have high insulin levels, you may have difficulty waking up. Or if you've got insulin resistance, you may arise in the morning and not feel rested or recovered at all. Morning appetite will change. So you should arise with appetite. If you are arising wanting to give yourself a kickstart, you'll be wanting to consume sugar or caffeine. It's a sign that your blood sugar is not under control. Or if you're arising with sugar cravings leading to a high sugar, high starch breakfast, it's showing that over time, your body, you haven't got the glucose in the body that you want. And I'll just leave it here. I won't say anything else on this slide and I'll send it out, but just to show that some of these are really useful signs and symptoms to understand whether you have blood sugar regulation issues and whether you don't. And then you can then start obviously making changes to help you. So now, it's now seemingly normal that sugar is such a big part of our life, which is quite scary. And it unfortunately also remains a very controversial topic with many different foods, because research is hard to do with nutrition studies because it often relies on recall by people that are in the study. There's obviously lots of other confounding factors. And unfortunately, it also can be heavily influenced by food companies with interest in the outcomes. It's come out recently that in relation to the food pyramid in America, that food companies are basically paying scientists to do research for them to get favorable outcomes so they could be on the food pyramid, which is not really what we want. So I'm not going to talk about this because I think we mostly know about what carbohydrates are, but basically any sort of carbohydrate will break down into sugar and go into our bloodstream. But we're really, for the purpose of this talk, we're really talking about sugar, not everything else. If you want to know about the other parts, more about carbohydrates, go back to the nutrition series that I previously did, especially talks 2 and 3, and we can share the videos when we send out the recording. That goes into this in a lot more detail. And again, this presentation is focusing on the refined versions of sugar, the ones you want to avoid. So what is the solution to reducing sugar? So it's focusing on eating a nutrient-dense whole food diet and adjusting our macronutrient ratios to reduce spikes in blood sugar. So by that, what I mean is that it's about making sure we have meals and snacks that contain a balance of carbohydrates, fats, and proteins. And so when you have fats and proteins alongside carbohydrates, it really helps lessen the impact on your blood sugar. What macronutrient ratio every individual needs is unique. And so you have to do a bit of trial and error work to figure that out for yourself. But as I just said, go back to the talks I've done before, because that has this in a lot more detail. The other one we're not going to touch on today is about increasing our daily physical activity and movement. And obviously we all have autoimmune conditions that affect our ability to move to varying degrees. So there's not one size fits all prescription of this, but using movement and getting our cardiovascular system, our muscles going can be extremely good for blood sugar regulation. As I've said, our muscles store glucose. So if we have bigger muscles, we can basically store more glucose, which then helps with blood sugar regulation. But I'm not talking about that. We'll have a wonderful series all about movement from Jill later on. And then what we are focusing on is reducing sugar consumption. It is hidden everywhere. And I could insert a swear word there because it is everywhere. So I'm just going to go into different types of sugar just briefly before we move on. So there's different types of sugar that are available, and this has changed over time. And so we obviously had our natural sweeteners, which have been around for a very long time. Different ones have different popularity spikes. So we have honey, maple syrup, molasses, coconut sugar. So these obviously come from natural sources, and they are minimally processed, and they have a favorable fructose to glucose ratio. And I'm not talking too much about fructose today, but things that are very high in fructose can actually affect our liver quite badly. It can affect our vitamin D levels and lower them, which is not ideal at all for anyone with an autoimmune condition or anyone in general. And they can also, it bypasses our satiety system. So we can just eat and eat and eat fructose until the cows come home. But also these kind of natural sweeteners contain some minerals like calcium, iron, and zinc. And these are not a reason to eat them in themselves, but they're a reason that they're better than others. Maybe with the exception of molasses. So 1 tablespoon of molasses or backstrap molasses contains 20% of the daily value of potassium, 10% of calcium and B6, 15% of iron, and also 15% of magnesium. And so it actually can be a higher source of iron than some sources of meat, which is quite incredible. Should we use them all the time? No, we shouldn't use any sugar all of the time. But yet it's a great alternative to the refined sugars like pure cane sugar that we use in recipes a lot. Try and use a honey or a maple syrup alternative based on what's available around you. And it can be useful, but in limited amounts. And the other thing is we can often reduce the sugar that is used in recipes if we kind of change our sweet tooth. Refined sugar. So refined sugar, as I talked about before, started being produced in the 1600s. This makes food taste good and it is accompanied with a calorie density. So as with natural sweeteners, these are both all high calorie foods. And so we're not confusing our body. It's sweetness is indicating calories, which is the case in this situation. But these have been stripped of nutrients. And so whenever we eat them, it's pulling nutrients out of our body to metabolize. So the other ones are artificial sweeteners. The artificial sweeteners have had a massive resurgence over I don't know how many years because they have like no calories in them. And so we're trying to get that sweet taste, but then without calories. And this is extremely confusing for our body because we are expecting to have a calorie influx when we eat sweet things. And so much so that this is actually causing, they think in the long run, people who have a high intake of these things to actually put on weight because of the confusion, metabolic confusion it is causing for our body. But there is very mixed research on this. And so the jury is still out. There's been links to cancer that have since been disreputed, links to things like Alzheimer's, very real links to things like mental health issues and dopamine issues. And as I said, they confuse our body and they are extremely sweet. So they're not really helping us in get rid of our sugar cravings, so we're just fueling the fire. So even though people say these are healthy, like we don't know the long-term effects of them, really. They're also man-made. And we all know what happened with omega-6 fats and them saying they're healthy, and now we realize how not healthy they are. So I would really use these with caution. We then move on to things like sugar alcohols, which are a lot used largely in the keto, kind of the low carb world. I don't know a huge amount about them, but this is what I do know, is that they have a lesser impact on blood sugar levels, and they are not as sweet as artificial sweeteners. And they are naturally occurring sugars typically found in small quantities in fruit, and then some of them are refined and purified for use as sweeteners. They tend to be low digestible carbohydrates, so they're not no calorie at all, but they don't really tend to be digested, and they're also fermentable. So these are definitely preferable, from what I understand, over artificial sweeteners, and can be really useful for weight loss and diabetics, where you really want to be careful of the sugar categories on the other page that we just talked about, but use them in limited amounts, not all of the time. However, some people really like them. So if you look at the work by Mark Hyman or Chris Kresser, they don't mind the use of them and they promote them over artificial sweeteners. But people like Sarah Ballantyne, who wrote and came up with the autoimmune protocol, she doesn't like them because they can affect your digestive health. Because they are fermentable, they can cause issues. If people have issues with their digestion, they can also affect your microbiome. So again, an individual response to these foods needs to be had. And so if you want to try them. Some people hate the taste of some of them. Some people, they'll cause digestive discomfort and digestion. And as we talked about, ensuring your gut is healthy is really, really important. So Susan, there's some examples on the left-hand side: sorbitol, xylitol, I think that's spelled wrong, erythritol, monk fruit are on the left-hand side of sugar alcohols. So I think the biggest thing, as we talked about, we can do is avoid hidden sugars and probably also avoid artificial sweeteners to add to that. It's easier to stay sugar-free when we're sticking to eating real food, and it's when we eat processed food that it becomes more difficult. Sugar is disguised on labels, it's split up into different forms, and there are 1,000,001 names for sugar. So turn over the label and read the packet and try to stick between to less than 5 grams per served. So sugar has many names. I'll share this with you, but there are so many names that sugar can possibly be used for. And companies are very kind of cheeky about what they do. And they use different forms to split it up on the label. They don't think you're going to recognize it. So sometimes you won't recognize, you won't even think it's a sugar by it being on there, but it is. So I thought I'd just go through a few things that you readily get in there. Is this an Australian supermarket? But I presume a Canadian supermarket is pretty similar. So orange juice. So 100% orange juice, no juice concentrate, no added sugar. 1 serving size is 200 milliliters, 4 teaspoons of sugar. So very little protein and fat. So the issue is with it, if you have it by itself, it's just going to spike your blood sugar. So you want to eat it with a protein or fat source like breakfast and have it in small amounts. Then you see something that's very interesting, which looks like juice, but it's not. It's an orange and mango fruit drink. Sounds not very nice. This has a similar amount of sugar in it, but look at the ingredient label. It's reconstituted orange juice, cane sugar, reconstituted mango juice, and then a whole load of flavors, preservatives, and natural colors to make it the beautiful color that it is. The next thing is a probiotic smoothie. You've seen that's a relatively good thing, right? Again, 250 mils is a serving, 5.5 teaspoons of sugar. But again, little protein, no fat, but there is a small amount of fiber, which will help with digestion. Still not ideal because as you see in the ingredients, there is no fat in there. There is no protein source in there. There's vitamin C, which has been added, which is likely synthetic. And it's just pear juice. A lot of smoothies will have juice in them as their first ingredient, which is if you buy it from the supermarket. So verdict, very high in sugar. And I think it's very high in unopposed sugar, so there's no protein and fat. So if you choose to consume, check the label if buy in store and just buy the cleanest one you can. Consume alongside a good source of protein and fat and only have a small amount. The best made is a homemade smoothie. So a homemade smoothie, you can add a source of fruit and vegetable. You can add definitely a protein and a fat source to make it more balanced. And so this is what my homemade smoothie builder, that basically you choose different things in different categories, you put it in a blender, you mix it up, and it's a great way to have a smoothie at home without buying an expensive one from the supermarket, and it's a lot better for you. I won't go into it, I will share the slides. Beverages. So all of these things are really high in sugar. So Milo, yes, I said have things that are under, you want to have things under 4 grams, so that's 1 teaspoon. So Milo is a chocolate drink you get in Australia. I'm sure you have similar versions of those sorts of like cocoa and stuff in Canada and also in other countries. That's got 2 teaspoons of sugar in it. And you'll see that actually on the label, you've got a mixture of milk solids, sugar, maltodextrin, and that's from corn in there, as well as lots of other things you don't really want to eat. Coca-Cola, 375 ml, 10 teaspoons of sugar, as well as other things. And then you get to the no sugar, caffeine-free cola, which has got no sugar in it, which is maybe confusing. But look at the sweeteners. So they don't list the sweeteners with their names, and with artificial ones, they give them all a number. So I'd also avoid those two. Up and Go, which in Australia, I don't know if you have it in Canada, it's labeled as a kind of a healthy breakfast drink that if I was at PwC still, I'd see people drinking it in the office. 4 teaspoons of sugar for 1 carton. And this is in many, it's got skim milk powder in, so not that much protein and fat. It's got maltodextrins from wheat and corn. So if you've got a gluten issue, should you really be eating it? Probably not. Cane sugar and also fructose. And I talked briefly about fructose before and avoiding it. Then you have Powerade, 600 mils, and people in Australia, as you call it, skull this when they're playing sport or if they're feeling down or if they're sick. 9 teaspoons of sugar in it, and all of these other colors and everything else. And liquid beverages, I think, are one of the worst culprits behind high-level sugar consumption. So avoid if you can. So better alternatives. Coconut water is one of my favorites because coconut water is full of electrolytes that are going to help our body function. But if you look at the sugar at the label, it's actually confusing because it's got 8.5 teaspoons of sugar per serve. but still it is a better choice than other things because it's natural. It's got electrolytes in. If you don't enjoy drinking it, don't drink it. Oh, yay. And it's great for drinking with meals because it helps with digestion. Kombucha is also good. It hasn't got a label on it because the sugar is fermented, so it's kind of unknown. But if you leave it for a long period of time, it will reduce its sugar content. Have it with meals, ideally. Don't overdrink it. All of these things in moderation. And then fruit and sparkling water is a great choice. Lemon juice and sparkling water with a dash of maple syrup, especially for those Canadians who have lots of maple syrup, can be a really good choice with meals, a really good way to get nutrients up. Salad dressings, another culprit for sugar that you may not realize. So tomato-based sauces contain like 1 teaspoon of sugar per serve. And also think about serving sizes. How often do you actually use one serve? And the food companies will manipulate the serving sizes to get the numbers, to make the numbers look more favorable. So probably with a stir fry sauce, a serving size is 43 grams, 2 teaspoons of sugar. Would you actually use one serve or would you use 2? Again, it's used a whole load of different things. You can see here lots of different forms of sugar split up. Sugar, golden syrup, brown sugar, honey, everywhere. It's everywhere. And then salad dressing. Sugar, again, why are you putting sugar in salad dressing? You don't need it. So my verdict, avoid, make your own. A lot of these things you can actually, if you can get some good recipe books or Google, you can find some very simple recipes to make these things yourself, and then you can freeze them. I put here a little table that I love for making salad dressings, and you can make all different types of salad dressings using this one table. So it basically gives you a recipe for adding an emulsifier together. So you have 1 teaspoon of emulsifier, 3 tablespoons of oil, and 1 tablespoon of acid, and you mix them together, and it makes your salad dressing. Make it in batch, leave it in the fridge for a week, and just add it onto salads when you need it. It doesn't have to be complicated. Dairy products. So things like dairy products will always have some sugar in it with the lactose. A whole fat Greek yogurt and the zero fat Greek yogurt actually have a very similar level of sugar in it. So 1 to 1.5, but their serving sizes are a bit different. The difference is that whole milk Greek yogurt has high levels of protein and fat in it, which will help slow down that sugar consumption, versus the low fat one has very little fat, but it still has the protein in it. So we want those fats. So have the whole fat one. We then get to the fruit flavored yogurts, which steer away from at all costs. First of all, they don't say low fat. They all seem to be, the ones I looked at, low fat. It's got 4 teaspoons of sugar in it for 1 serving size. So what about just adding raspberries to your yogurt and making your own? And then the last one is very interesting, vanilla flavored yogurt. What's that? 8 teaspoons of sugar per serve. So again, look at the label. Dairy products, so milk. Milk has also got sugar in it, it's got lactose in it. But the issue here is that per serving size, there are still 3 teaspoons of sugar, but the issue is with the insulin effect. And so dairy products are what we call highly insulinogenic. And so for some reason, even though the sugar may not cause the blood sugar to rise, they do cause more insulin to be released than white bread. And so high insulin, even without high blood sugar or glucose, can stimulate inflammation, trigger hunger and cravings, and also with high intake can cause insulin resistance. So imagine having this with your Milo, you're then creating a bit of a perfect storm. So yes, have milk if you want to and you'll tolerate it, but have it full fat, organic if you can, and just have it in moderation and just be really mindful. Other sources of hidden sugar, which I think you kind of get the message, but have a look at everything that you buy. And over time, just start looking for better alternatives. Yet it's still, the insulin effect is still present in yogurt and cheese, as far as I'm aware, but I think especially probably milk. But yeah, it's still in everything. So I still think a good quality cheese is best than full fat yogurt, but don't eat it in vast quantities. Oh yeah, and Marilyn, yeah, of course. The sugar, when kombuchas can use real sugar, like can use stevia or erythritol, which will have 0 teaspoons of sugar, because it's a a sugar alcohol, or it could have some sugar, pure cane sugar in it, which will have a sugar reading on it. So other sources of hidden sugar: cereals and granola, packaged breads, including whole grain kinds, snack or granola bars, low-fat foods, dried fruit, and other fruit snacks and restaurant foods. And I will update the presentation afterwards. I'll put some more different alternatives in there for different things. But the key thing is, in the supermarket, there are better options than others. So please read the ingredient labels and be careful. So how to avoid hidden sugars? Use natural sweeteners in moderation. So honey, maple syrup, coconut sugar, they are good sources of sugar. As we said, they have calories in them. They have less synthetic additives and things in them, but use them carefully. Consume more healthy fats because they help calm the insulin effect. They can't help calm the blood sugar effect. And watch your sugar intake at breakfast. So if you have high sugar breakfast or a high refined carbohydrate source at breakfast, this can start you off on the wrong foot for the day and start that roller coaster going. So focusing on breakfast, if that's the first thing you do, and instead of having things like waffles, granola, cereal, oats, canned fruit, have something like eggs and vegetables or chia seed puddings or something else that can be really, really, really beneficial and not spike that blood sugar. Rethink your snacks, because many snack foods like protein bars or bliss balls, flavored yogurt, roasted nuts can have sugar in them. All sorts of things can be high in sugar. So opt for hard-boiled eggs, a smoothie, nut butter with carrot and vegetable sticks. Don't drink your calories we've talked about. Have water, herbal teas, coconut water and plain coffee rather than Powerade, Up and Go. Make your own sauces and salad dressings, and clear out your pantry for when you have those cravings. The worst thing is going, I'm going to be good. And then when you get that craving, you kind of fall off the bandwagon and go to your pantry. Get rid of it. It doesn't need to be in the house. And find an accountability buddy to help you. So again, everyone's different. Everyone's going to react differently to food. So use your symptoms. How are you feeling throughout the day? Energy, cravings, ability to concentrate. I'll send out the slides so you can have a look at that day in the life of different people. You can get your doctor to you can look at your blood test results with the help of your doctor, in particular your fasting glucose, your HbA1c, and your insulin levels. And you can even use a continuous glucose monitor or a glucometer to understand your individual reactions to food and lifestyle. But again, you can do that with your doctor. And that's really it. But what the end goal is for this is really dependent on your health goals. And so really have a think about, if you want to lose weight, reduce inflammation, or if you have diabetes or insulin resistance, you're going to have a very different approach to wanting to optimize your health. So it really depends. The approach you take depends on where you are. Anyway, as usual, I've talked far too much, but remember, it's the small things you do every day that make a big difference. And I hope I haven't scared the living daylights out of you about sugar.